Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. It's time for another awesome lightning talk. I'm Parag Katkar, your host for tonight. I'm the head of consulting practices at InRhythm. InRhythm is a modern product and technology consulting firm, and our product experts and our practice leads, they stay on top of the latest technology trends in the industry. And every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time, one of our consultants shares their knowledge on these exciting trends with you. And this week, Oleg Ivanov, who is a design tech architect with us, is going to share his knowledge on building framework agnostic DLS components for web. So without further ado, let's get it started, Oleg.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. So today we're going to focus on the, like Parag said, building framework agnostic design language system components for the web. And I want to mention that DLS is a very hot topic right now. A lot of companies have DLS, and a lot of companies are looking to develop their own design language systems. But even the companies that do have design language systems, there's always, they fail to develop the DLS properly. They fail in terms of governance, adaptability, integrity. So we're going to touch on one aspect today, what can make a design language system a success. And we're going to focus on native technologies. How can we simplify a design language system and make it rely on native CSS and HTML? So I'm going to start by defining what is a design language system, right? And I'm going to start with this short but powerful quote, which says underlying language design. A design language system is basically an underlying language that unites design philosophies and methodologies across the whole platform. So now what that means, that the whole idea of design goes back not only to the design group, but it also, the whole idea of the system in itself touches upon code, the way you work together in a DLS group, right? It's not just about design anymore, it's about code design, it's about code semantics, it's about code simplicity, right? So you can see a little bit more here on the screen. So you can say that DLS incorporates techniques, semantics, and guidelines driven by common cohesive language between design and technology. So in DLS, design and technology, the whole collaboration with design and technology, where they merge together, becomes very important. We often see problems in development when designers are not really working together with developers. So this gap creates issues, and this is the biggest reason that a lot of DLSs fail, right? But by bringing the design methodology into the way we code things, we make things, or the way we even communicate within any, it doesn't have to be a design language system, right? We can improve and we can achieve things that were not possible before, and there's many benefits to it, and we'll touch on them on slides. So I'm gonna go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a really interesting quote. I've always liked this quote. It says everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? So this has a direct application to when you think what is a design language system, right? So we struggle, any developer, right? Any organization always struggles with things like, we live in an age where technology is so, there's a kind of like technology fatigue. I don't know the right word for it, but there's so many frameworks, there's so much going on. We are always in an update cycle. We're always migrating to a new technology. We're always updating, right? And this is the biggest struggle that everybody, faces. But when we talk about design in itself is very simple. It strives on harmony, simplicity, right? It's about patterns, right? But when we talk of code, it goes the other way. It's about problems, solutions, complications, right? How to solve things. So the idea behind DLS, how can we merge the design and development and bring those two groups together and work, and bring and how can we use the same idea in technology and use the technology in the right way so that we can, make things possible, right, within DLS. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So this slide focuses on explaining how can we. So the whole idea, the whole success of design language system lies on its separation of its being framework agnostic, right? Whenever we build anything in any framework, as any developer knows, you sort of attach to the framework, and it becomes very difficult for you to upgrade, maintain, right, and do design, updates, because everything is relying on a framework. But as we know, technology changes. But one thing that never changes is the native browser technology, like or native browser languages, right? Which is HTML markup language and CSS styling, right? This is always native to any browser, right? The browsers are made to work and to understand HTML and CSS. They're not made to work with frameworks. Frameworks are built to output HTML and CSS. So the question becomes, why are we using a framework to do something visually? Because design language system is about delivering this, visual and design and this user experience to the user. So why are we using a framework to implement a design language system if at the end of the day it delivers HTML and CSS, right? So a design language system, if built properly, and we can use basically HTML and CSS native technologies to achieve exactly the same thing, or even achieve bigger things, right, by utilizing the native CSS HTMLs. Unfortunately, a lot of developers, this is what developers do, right? We as developers, we like to think about problems, about frameworks, complex solutions. We are trained to think about frameworks, functions, things. But design, like I was saying, this is the reason it's called design language system, right? It's about simplicity. It's about making things very easy to understand, very easy to maintain, very easy, to update. And when we couple the visual element of it with the framework, we go back and where it becomes hard to achieve those things. So to have a successful design language system, right, what we want to focus on the core native technologies, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? Because, like I said, any framework at the end of the day, it delivers HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript, no matter however you look at it, right? But frameworks change, right? So for us to have, to prepare ourselves for the future, or for any organization to make sure that down the line, right, they can save the money, they can have a system that doesn't depend on any technology, doesn't depend on any limitation, we can always go back to HTML and CSS, because will never change. That HTML and CSS is the standard, the spec of a CSS HTML always gets updated. So we're seeing how CSS right now is becoming more, it's evolving. There's so many features in CSS that unfortunately a lot of people don't know. Why? Because developers naturally they like to learn new tech, new frameworks, right? But we are forgetting to focus back on the core principle, fundamental CSS and HTML, which is so advanced that people don't even realize it. And if we use it, we can skip in terms of focusing, and sort of in terms of DLS, we can skip frameworks altogether. So this slide we will talk about HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript, but I also have here web components and lit, right? We can, sometimes we have frameworks, right? And they like to import components, right? And they will like to have libraries. So, right, if you give some companies, some groups HTML and CSS, they might not know what to do with it. So to take it one step above just the native HTML and CSS and JavaScript, we'll say we can utilize native web components. We can use lit to build them, right? Now we have packages. We can distribute those components to the frameworks. So these frameworks can now take our HTML, CSS, JavaScript and build functionality on top of the layout layer. So another thing I want to mention here that I might have not explained, the whole success of DLS is to separate the layout layer from the functional layer. So functional layer can be taken care of the framework, React, any kind of framework you want to think. But if we build DLS in such a way, because DLS focuses on the presentation, right, on design. So if we use that, if we use native technologies for that, and we use frameworks to do functional implementations, now we separated the two layers, and now this is like becomes like a modular development, right? HTML and CSS and JavaScript is one layer. Component framework components is another layer. Now they work together. So if you separated those two, if you ever wanted to, if an organization ever wanted to migrate to any other framework, or they wanted to update something, or a new version of that framework came by, they don't have to worry about breaking their layout visual layer, because it's completely separated from the workup. It makes migration so much easier, right? So some other tools I want to mention before we go into a demo, we'll do a small demo right now, is something we use for tools. We can use something like Storybook, right? So we have web components. Storybook offers us a way to use the same, the HTML, CSS, but make it more interactable, right? Because not every designer knows how to play with HTML and CSS. We can offer designers snippets or pieces of code that sort of allows them to play and use them as building blocks and do things, but some people can't, right? Sometimes you need a technology, which is not really a framework, but a technology like Storybook that you can use with automated tests, visual regression tests. So here I kind of have the core tools we can use. In reality, I would say it's HTML, CSS, JavaScript only. Then we can spice it up a little bit with web components, and we can use lit as a popular way to implement them. But I guess this is a good time to go into a nice demo. So what we're gonna talk about here for this lightning talk is about how can we, like, the power of CSS3 and semantic HTML, and how can we use different token strategies to build a design language system consisting of many different components, right, which work together, even though they are separate components, right? A lot of frameworks, they focus on how do you make components so independent, and right? But when we talk design language system, yes, it's about atomic development, right? Yes, components are a separate entity, but in a design language system, everything was together, right? And I'm gonna now switch to a small demo to show you guys basically what we just covered. So imagine a design language system with a bunch of components, right? So just for the demo, this is just a set of components thrown together on a page. There's no, like, we're not going to focus here on layout, theming, or like big things or grid systems, but that's also part of design language system, right? Design language system is not just components. It's about the whole system as a whole. It's theming, it's grid system, it touches up on a lot of things, but for this, we're just going to focus on the components. So here we have like a sample progress indicator, popular progress indicator component that people use. And here, like, the way we want to think about this is a small presentation of different permutations of that component, right? And just to, to show you guys how it's, my setup here. So there's no there's no framework here. There's no nothing is running here. This is just pure HTML CSS structure, right? So when we talk about progress indicator component, right, it's really simple. We use a very simple structure. It's set up, and like I said earlier, the whole design language system relies itself on configuration, on, I can say, which I can call a token strategy, right? Tokens are basically CSS3 variables. So when we talk about CSS3 variables, another way to them, you might have ever heard what tokens are. Everybody wants to make everything configurable, right? Everybody wants to make things changeable, right? Themable. Like an organization might have 20 different business units under their umbrella, and why can't you make one system that drives all those 20 different business units that can have a totally unique look and feel to them? But the way we could, if we build our, so basically if we build our components properly, we can achieve that. We can have one system, one code base that drives 20 or 30 or 100 different sites with components that have totally a different look and feel to them, just by utilizing a token strategy. So there's different ways of using a token. There's different ways you can implement a token strategy. So token strategy, meaning basically, how do you define your token system, right? One example is you have your set of colors, a set of colors for an organization. You might have a whole palette of them to meet your accessibility guidelines, right? You can have a setup that every color down the line meets the 1:3 contrast ratio, right? You might have different things. You have your font setup, right? You can have your, just as an example, this is a very simple, right, setup. You can have different variables, like you can outline, define that you want to control your focus outline styles, which I will demo shortly. Here we have a different set of font families, small, medium, and large. Then you can have, so if you take a look at here, I'm using config.css, so I'm looking at the config file. So here we can have in this one config file, this is basically can be your whole setup for your whole site, right? There's one code base, you can think of it like you have one component, but you have many config files per business unit. Each business unit has a config file. So this is an example of a configuration file that a business unit might have in an organization. So here's your config for all your buttons. So this config gives you a lot of controls. You can control everything. How big it looks? It's the font. Is it a square button? Is it a circular button? How are buttons, behave? How do they behave on hover? Are they accessible or not? So this is a config file. So if you think, config file is basically a CSS file, and it's separated from the rest of CSS. For example, this is a button CSS file, right? And it has its own tokens as well. Like we can define our own tokens here in a button, for example, and we can redefine them. But if we set up our code and button and components properly, it becomes a system. It's very important for it to be a system, right? Everything is independent, but yet dependent. It's like an atomic design principle, but applied to code as well. So here's an example of a config file, right? So for the demo here, right? So this is one. There's another one I did for the demo, which has a different sets of colors, right? So, and I'm gonna go back to my browser just to get you back, guys. So, and here, so I was talking about token strategy previously, right? So depending how you wanna configure your site using the token strategy, either you wanna have each component its own level of control, or you want a global, like I showed you, a configuration file where it touches the button, or maybe you don't want to give that business unit a control over a button. Maybe your config file can just have a definition of colors because that's what you decided. And you might just remove all of this and it will use the default, right? So in this example, for example, this config file touches on a button. So this is the definition for the button. So another way to do it is, and going back for analogous to button, here's a progress indicator, right? So this progress indicator has its own setup here, but this is now modular. This is setup that lives inside. The token strategy for this component was that you configure it, a developer can configure it. It's owned by a design system. It's not configured by external file, but it relies on tokens that are configured externally, which I showed you. So for example, here we can say, well, here's we have this organization might want their have progress steps bigger. So all I have if I update a CSS variable, right, all of a sudden I see my component, every instance of component change instantaneously. Now notice there's no JavaScript running, there's no framework running, there's no page reload, there's no refresh. Some of you people might know this, but the way you can use this, it becomes like, if you can use it, it can replace any framework, right? You don't have to have any longer like complex, like event listeners going on, or anything is states running, right? To do things like this. You can, do pretty much anything with your token system. And if you can just notice here how they're referencing something else. So let's say I wanted to change the border color for an incompleted step. So all I did is here, updated the token. Now everything that used that particular mapping of the token will get updated straight away. Now think of the possibility, think of the benefits of this, because I'm doing this like using the inspector, but in reality, I would be doing it in the config file, right? So think about this in terms of a server performance or user experience. Every web browser has cache, right? Every server caches its requests. So when you have all your components built using native CSS variables, you no longer have to cache. You no longer have to recache every instance or every variation of component. The only thing that has to be recached is the config file, which is basically one. It can be for a large organization, it can be only like a few kilobytes in size, because it's just text. It's just right. So think of how many rounds of requests are you saving now? Think of the performance of the browser. The browser doesn't have to repaint or redo anything, because this is native to the browser. The browser is built to handle CSS. And if you can see, if you ever inspected any sort of like underperforming site, you would see the CSS hell that happens in there. But that's because they're not following the semantic HTML and CSS, right? They're not doing things the way they were meant to be. We as developers tend to forget the core technologies that were there for us to use, and we tend to go to frameworks that are very complex. But at the end of the day, they do the same thing that can be achieved nowadays. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was a little bit more difficult, but the advantage of the new CSS selectors, of the CSS variables and how they work together gives us tremendous control of what we can do. So just to give you more, just I don't wanna, if I'm changing on the fly, everything changes. So imagine if this one file gets updated, you can have a website can have its takeovers. It can have special holiday events. It can have a Halloween theme if it wants to, right? And one example of that, like here, if I open the head, right, let's say I'm going to point to a different config file, which I set up earlier, which I opened before. It just has different colors. I'll update it and see this is another, like all of a sudden, all the colors updated. So, so config 2, right? So it's the same component, but the point here is it happens instantaneously, and it works, and it's scalable, and it's the amount of developer work is reduced so much because you don't longer have to touch framework code. You no longer have to touch any code, only configuration. But that means you have to develop that design system, right? Without the design system, not possible. So here, here's the same example for the button, right? Like I mentioned before, for our button, instead of having a button level configuration, we have a small mapping going on here, but it's not too much, but the configuration lives in the config file, right? So for our button, we can go to a button config and we can say, well, for my, so we have, for example, have primary and secondary button, right? We might have 3 buttons, but for example, for our main button, let me find it before I lose my, so we might want, trying to think, change our border radius and make a square button, right? And let me zoom in just a little bit so it's more visible to what I'm doing. So let's find the button config again. So here we go, button. So now we can, so we can now have a control of every single button, and as you can see, everything updates instantaneously. Think of the power of this, because now it's independent control, right? Now you can have a square button, and you can have border color can be light. I don't know. Trying to think of pretty colors, but this is not a good color to choose. But just for the demo set, I'll choose the red, right? So only the primary buttons get updated. Anything else is not touching. So, and this is all from one file, right? No components were hurt during this presentation, like no components were, like nothing was done, nothing was updated, no developer had to suffer touching every single instance of a component. But right, so let me now go back and demo something else again. So as I said, we have tokens here. So we have component specific tokens, but let's say we have some global tokens here, which I pre-made for the demo. For example, you know how we have focus elements, we can focus states. So for this button, we have a outline focus, right? So let's say we want to increase that and make it a little bit like further away, and we want to make it like a little thicker. And sorry, not the right one. We want to make it like really fat, right? And we want to make it red color. So now all of a sudden, you see what's going on now. All the, like I just changed the style and look completely. So you can think, let's say you have a business unit that focuses on kids, right? And kids like things round, big, and huge. So what, you don't need to build anything new. You can completely, right now we're focusing here on just colors, and I showed you like some sizing, right? But you think of it that you can control everything, like colors, spacing, outline, positioning, just with a proper token strategy. And when we talk about token strategy, I want to mention that it's important to, when I say token, that doesn't mean like every single property will have its own token. This is very important, because when we have, that becomes unmanageable. If you have a site, a big design language system with millions of, like hundreds of components, this becomes unmanageable. You can manage 1,000 tokens. It's a potential for things to disintegrate and break. So your token strategy becomes important. How do you, so as I mentioned here, we have a set of colors. How do you map your color, like you have your primary color and secondary? What do you want to, map it to? What do you want to, think? How do you want to have this color map into where? So in this instance, this color primary 500 is mapping to the outline of a secondary button and to the background color of a primary button, right? So by doing a proper token strategy, basically it achieves the same purpose as when an artist has a palette. You have like 10 colors, and instead of having a palette of millions of colors, each artist, painter, has its own unique look, because he tends to use this sort of a subset of colors to achieve what he needs. So this is essentially what token strategy does. How do you define your tokens? How do you map them properly and achieve what you need for your organization, right? So now we're going to go back to what I showed initially. We have, I'll go back to our main file, right? Just to play around with it. let me go back to this. So,
When you're done with that, Oleg, Shane has a question, I believe.
oh
Yeah.
yes, go ahead. Just feel free to jump.
Yeah, no. So my question, so obviously I saw you changing one component, but is there a way that you can change? Okay, you're showing me that, right?
Yeah,
You want to change all components across the component library?
yeah. So the thing here to notice is this particular token or configuration CSS3 variable maps to multiple places in different components. So we can have a spacer component, for example. It might control the spacing between elements. It might control things like, like the possibilities becomes unlimited. Basically, you can think of possibilities like accessibility colors, right? You might have people who have special settings on their system, and we can target it with CSS. And we don't have to do any component work, because all we have to do, one example of this, like I think we can see it. Here's a go. So here's an example how we can just make everything update, the look on everything just by updating a token when you have your first high contrast mode enabled, meaning like high contrast black and white, right? So we can control exactly what the person sees, but we don't have to redevelop anything. We just have to update that particular token that will not magically, but by system, target those individual things in particular components. So here's one like nice component I like it's gives it. So this shows a token strategy that applies to a single component. So we have a toggle component as an example, right? So here we define a token that controls its width and height. So you might think, okay, yeah, that's, everybody knows this. We're not kids here. But think of it, this token is not just controlling its width, it's the way it's integrated, it automates everything. So if I'm increasing the width of the component, everything else updates. You see this thing? So all of a sudden, like I didn't do anything. Like all of a sudden, this is pure CSS. There's no JavaScript running here at all. There's no JavaScript or anything. So all of a sudden, I'm just updating the token, but because this particular token is smartly integrated, this kind of, I don't know what you call it, this circle knows how to scale itself based on the width of the component. Things know how to react, and it's instantaneously. To a browser, it's simple, it's fast. The user experience becomes optimized because you can think of it as the user visited the web page. He already has cached a lot of things. And if you ever want to break cache, like on a config file, that's all you have to do. So, but for the browser to break cache on a 3 kilobyte file is nothing, and it's instantaneous, right? So for this component, like, let's see if we can change something else. And Shane, you wanna, what else you wanna? So
I mean, yeah.
Here's another one.
Around. So I think we get the point, right? I think you're saying the power of HTML, CSS is that you can really do a lot of that. You don't need the framework. This was pretty good.
Yeah, and then we can we can do things. I want to go back to this one where so for example, so now going back to the prime, I don't know what's the right way to call it, but if we go back to our font definitions, and we can say, well, these components I know because I made them. They use font medium, right? What if I want to update the font medium size to this? And I went over this before, why we have different sizes, right? To offer scales. I want to say we're going to update, this token to 20. So all of a sudden you see what's happening. If I'm updating the size of the medium, so this token integrates into every component. So everything is updating in the system. I don't have to go through every component, make updates to every single component, because every component, it targets this token. So you can see sort of the power of what we can do with this, because there's unlimited, like I can go for hours and hours showing like grid.
I think I think that you answered my question, right? So you can change something globally.
Yeah, right now I just changed look and feel by changing a config file. I just pointed to a different config, and basically, which I showed here. It's the same config, just one has. The only difference is I changed the colors here, and I updated the sizes a little bit. But you can see how all of a sudden this becomes a totally different, experience. And you think of it not just visuals and space layouts, it's animations too. Imagine we have a token that says, what animation do I want on hover? I want this button to increase and have this small bubble effect for kids, or I want this emphasis and we can achieve that. And again, no development time is needed, right, to achieve that. And that's very powerful because, most of things that any organization struggles with is, maintenance. Maintenance is a big thing. Cost saving, how do you make things, so they, efficient, and govern. And there's many things we can talk about in DLS: governance, integrity, adaptability, and maybe in the future we'll do that. But there's a lot of topics that DLS touches on, and this is just a small kind of sneak peek of what you can do, with things and with color. There's so much time, right, to go in, but it just shows you the power of it. And I guess I'll go back to my slide right now. So I mentioned some of this before, and some of the benefits are like caching is amazing. Like imagine a large organization that has millions of requests per second from thousands of users. How much server cost and server maintenance can you, like, the money you can save is it's huge. And also user experience becomes optimized because of caching, because you're using the technology, the native technologies properly. Think of rendering and paint speed. Think about customization, the level of customization you can do. And not only it's about customization, but you can go from any framework to any framework with no effort. You can switch to a framework literally in few days, because you're not gonna, if you have your DLS, and we didn't touch a lot of aspects of DLS, but if you have properly implemented DLS, to switch to a framework doesn't require you to redo any of the visual stuff, which as developers know, that a lot of time is spent and wasted in that, like how to make things properly render for different platforms, for different browsers. And another thing I want to mention, not to forget the mobile native apps. Mobile deals with this exactly the same thing. And there's a lot of things I say here applies to mobile development as well. It's not just web, right? But so DLS mindset is a little bit different from a regular development that every developer is used to, right? There's efficiency, like I said, but the key thing is that we have to focus on layout layer implementation, layout layer only. Because if we integrate the functional layer and the framework, now we become coupled to that technology. And that's the problem. That's the problem every organization has. They try to mix their layout layer into React. They put Java, CSS in JS. They put everything. So now you're dependent on JS. You're depending on React to update your components. There's no way to go away, because now your CSS is structured dynamically. You can't even decouple it and port it over or remove it from there. You have to redevelop everything from scratch. It's just, it becomes a huge bottleneck for everybody. Yeah. So I guess I'll go back now to, I guess if anybody has any questions, we can talk forever about this, but I'm open to some exciting and cool questions if you guys have.
I have a question actually. What's up,
Yep.
Oleg?
Hey, Kevin.
Nice to see you. Thanks for the talk.
Yep.
What do you see as like the I'm trying to think about how to phrase this question. So you talked about how, if you have CSS and JS and everything's all tightly coupled, it's a pain in the neck, right?
Right, correct.
And if a company wants to transition or, upgrade or basically do anything, changing their architecture, it's a pain in the neck for front-end developers. So at what rate do you see like companies adapting this strategy DLS, and how likely is it that everybody's going to be able to do this, to take the time to, decouple all their CSS from their JavaScript and like actually port over to like a purely DLS system?
Yeah. So one thing, unfortunately, DLS is a big how do you say, mind change, or like is a change of how you approach things. And of course, the idea of you don't put a band-aid on something that's broken. You can fix you can't really, the way for DLS to be successful, you literally have to start from scratch, right? And that goes to your question, like, it's, and unfortunately, yes, you will have to redevelop and decouple your visual implementation logic and visual, like that touches on visual and layout aspects and everything from those frameworks, and have React focus specifically on functional implementation, on data on getting your data of managing all of these interactions. And I mean, for any organization that wants to adopt a DLS and they have a technology, I say the best way and the fastest way, because to fix something that's already integrated, to fix when you have a layout and layout layer integrated into your framework, it will take much longer time to fix that than to start from scratch and then not necessarily throw out your existing React code that touches on functional implementation and whatever logic needs to be there. You can reuse that, but make sure you take out all the stuff. And that, of course, that's not an easy task. But I've seen in huge enterprises where you by focusing on design language system and having a dedicated special team that goes out there, as a hitman, right, creates a stellar design language system. You can take any framework, you can take your existing components and port it over, like literally like lightning fast, right? Because it's like you think of it like, oh, I have to do a new project, I have to rebuild this from scratch. But no, the way, like, and I couldn't get in this presentation to it, the way everything built and maintained and organized, it simplifies the job for the developers. We have like Sid here and some other people who worked with me. And, there's so many great things I hear from them is when, they don't have to longer, like when Sid develops a component, he doesn't have to anymore think about things like, oh, this doesn't look right. He can think about functionality. He can use his brain power to do the things he does best, right? And leave all the other layout implementation logic to the DLS system that already guarantees that if he uses this component, if he puts this button here, if he makes his screen size really small, or he puts too much text into a button, it will look good. He doesn't have to do this repetitive random things to every component, because that's a lot of developers don't like doing that. It's a hassle. And you guys know, like 10, 15, 20 years back, we had IE6, IE7, IE10, 11. I go back to days of IE6 when I had to develop for that and making sure things look perfectly on IE6, even though IE11 was still already the latest browser. So I guess I kind of answered that question, but yeah, starting from scratch is the best thing. And it will really not in the long run, but it will deliver and improve and, have so many benefits.
Thanks a lot, Oleg. Thanks, Oleg, for such an informative talk. And to get more such questions answered, watch out for the DLS Summit. We're planning that soon with many more interactive talks and demos like this. And as a reminder to all of you, we do these lightning talks every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And next week, Minhazur Rahman, who is a senior Android engineer with us, is going to give an overview of Jetpack Compose navigation. And as a lot of you know, declarative UI is a mega trend, and both web and mobile are actively adopting this approach. Jetpack Compose is Google's modern toolkit for building native Android UI, and Minhazur will go over the navigation component of Jetpack Compose. And I'm really looking forward to this talk. Make sure you mark your calendar for next week. Thank you once again for joining. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all next week.